What's up guys, my name is Guy and welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'm going to be taking notes from my Roam research and I'm going to be turning it into content. I'm thinking of making a lot more videos like that because I find that for a lot of us, that's the biggest pain point. I think we've all gotten quite good at finding different systems and ways that work for us personally of how to collect notes in Roam. But the question now is, how do you turn those notes into content across a variety of different media, be that for video or for an essay, for a school paper, or for an article that you want to publish online. All of those things require an effective and systematic ways of taking notes from Roam and turning it into whatever content you want to create. So what I'm looking to do is show you one way, not the only way, but one way that I found to be effective when it comes to taking notes and turning it into any piece of content that you like. And for the purposes of this example, I'm going to be creating an article. We're going to go through step by step, and we're going to be using the Zettelkasten method as our effective way of taking notes and running it through a step-by-step machine, so to speak, all the way to a finished product. A while ago on this channel, I tested the Zettelkasten method for myself for a week straight, and I found it to be quite effective. And from that experiment, there are still a bunch of blurbs from this book, Excellent Sheep, that I ended up having as permanent notes. So as a quick recap, while everybody uses a slightly different variation and application of this Zettelkasten concept, in my case, what I ended up doing is taking the scratch notes, which here were book highlights coming into my Roam, and I turned them into literature notes, which ended up just being a description in my own words of what the note was saying. It slims it down a little bit, and sometimes it even pulls from a couple of different notes. And what you'll end up with is a shortened down, more concise and personal version of the concepts discussed in your notes. And the next step, and that's the important one, is then turning those literature notes into permanent notes. And permanent notes can either be an elaboration on the concepts of the literature notes, or it can be pulling in different literature notes from across your Roam graph and turning them into basically now a more concise description of all the concepts discussed in those literature notes. But the important thing is that a permanent note should ultimately read like an unfinished essay paragraph, like a draft of, something larger discussed within those themes or within those notes. And that's the important thing, because if you do Zettelkasten for a long period of time, you are effectively sitting on a large number of drafted essay paragraphs. And now in this video, I'm going to show you an easy and quick way of taking all of those essay paragraphs, those permanent notes, and putting them together into an essay structure, or that can just as easily substitute for a video or a blog post. The framework that we're going to be going over here stays the exact same no matter what the ultimate piece of content is intended to do. And so from this last experiment with Zettelkasten, I have a large number of permanent notes already in my graph, but I want to add a couple more so that we have more material to work with, and that way I can show you exactly the step-by-step way of taking a scratch note to a permanent note and then into an essay. And so we start with the literature notes page. You want to set up a separate page for your literature notes, which in my case here is already populated from my last video. But in your sidebar, you then want to open the actual highlights of the book. And so in this case, we're basing our essay on this book. We're going to take a specific concept from that book and talk about it in a brief essay, which again can double as a video or a blog post. But it doesn't matter what you're ultimately writing, because even if you're not pulling information from a book, the important thing is that wherever your source notes live, you want to open that in your sidebar. So in this case, it's highlights. So we're going to be clicking Shift and opening those highlights in the sidebar. And you'll see why in a second, because now I'm going to be going through those notes and pick out the ones that I find relevant enough to turn into a literature note. With the last experiment, I think I turned every single one into a literature note. That is not actually required. You can very much, customize that, because you might have gone a little crazy when highlighting stuff, or if your source notes are something entirely different, like your personal journals or your morning pages, let's say, you can go through. So even this step can be an additional point of editing, because maybe you don't connect with a particular note as much anymore as you did when you were reading it. And so that would be an indicator that you might not want to turn it into a literature note. And so the first note here that catches my eye is this particular one here. This one talks about the uncertainty that people feel in college because certain career paths don't have a step-by-step, blueprint laid out in terms of how to actually get there. So now I'm simply going to describe this concept in my own words. So here I came up with a 4-line paragraph describing this very point. It's not that much shorter than the original note, but it gets a couple of important concepts across, which I know I'm going to want to talk about later on. And now what I'm doing, so that I make sure I remember the original source, which is very important if you're quoting things in an essay, is to actually Option or Alt drag that exact note into my page. And now it's going to create a reference underneath here. That's just by pressing Alt and dragging at the same time. And now you can immediately see where the literature note came from. And then here's another nice example as well. I'm realizing that the next couple of notes in here all talk about something fairly similar. These are all things that stood out to me when I was reading the book, so I highlighted them, but now I feel like I can actually condense a couple of different notes down into one literature note. So all of this surrounds the same idea, which is that a lot of us, when we leave college and enter the professional world, we are trying to stay what we call stem cells for as long as possible, meaning that we don't want to specialize at the fear of potentially missing out on alternative options that may also be open to us. So now I'll just pull in all of those different notes that have informed that literature note, and I'm going to put them below. So see here, I actually pulled in all 5 notes, and that really condensed a lot of things down because I realized that a lot of those notes really talk about the same ideas. Now in a permanent note, I'm going to be able to expand on that and potentially pull in a couple of other literature notes for extra information as well. And so that will be the next step, and the way we do that is by simply converting the literature note into a page itself and then drafting the permanent note in that very page. So first we're going to start with this one. And so now I'm copy pasting some basic categorization functions here that I've had from my other literature notes and that I recommend you set up, or at least something similar to this. All it does is it says that it's a permanent note. So if I'm ever just searching for permanent notes in general for extra inspiration, I have an actual page that pulls in all of the permanent notes from across the graph. So the source, of course, is excellent cheap, but this here is important. So these we can change, and that's going to be important later on in the essay. So a couple of extra keywords might be passion, it might be work, it might be career, and is there anything else here? Maybe success, because that's probably something I talk about elsewhere in my graph as well. So those are a couple of nice keywords, and we're going to see how they factor into this later on. Related notes, I'm sure there are a lot of related notes, but to be honest, no specific one pops into my mind. So right now I'm going to leave this empty because I know I'm going to be pulling together a bunch of different permanent notes afterwards anyway to form this essay. And so now I'm going to be drafting the permanent note by looking at this literature note and just seeing what else pops into my mind, if there's any way to elaborate on this topic a little bit more. And I'm giving myself about 1 or 2 paragraphs to do so. So I'm pretty happy with that, and then I'll move on to the second literature note that I created here. I'm going to highlight that as well. And so now I'm done with this. I'm pretty happy with that. There was one instance here where I actually wanted to paraphrase something in the original notes to pull in a little bit more data, and that is why it's so important to use Option drag to pull in the original notes from the sidebar into your literature notes, because now when you're creating your permanent note, you can just hop down here, you see all of the original notes underneath your literature notes here in your linked reference, and so it becomes very easy to pull in a little bit of this important data here, like the 50% stat from Harvard seniors in 2007, and pulling that up there. And that's something that you notice when you're creating your permanent note, because you'll be writing a statement and right away you'll think, wow, I need to back this up, I need some data. Where do I get the data? Usually from the source, right? So that's why this system works pretty well and just, speeds up things for you, and you don't have to break your flow because you know right away where you can get this information from. And now for the important part, turning those permanent notes into an essay. The way I would set this up is to create a separate page for your essay, but before you do that, you want to make sure that you have the things that you want to collect in your sidebar ready to simply pull into your essay. So I'm going to do this before I even create the essay page. I'm going to get rid of the highlights over here, and I'm going to open up the literature notes, because those are effectively the titles of my permanent notes. So I'm going to want to open the ones that I think are going to be useful in the sidebar. So let's go through, and I'm just going to open up the ones in the sidebar by shift clicking on those. So I've pulled in, I believe, 5 permanent notes into my sidebar. So let's see whether what I wrote with this is going to be enough to form a very short but concise essay about this very topic. What I'm going to do here is create a new note. I like to do this in my daily notes. Everybody has their own preference for this depending on where you want to house an essay like this, but I quite like to do it in my daily notes. So I'm just going to write the title of the essay here. So this is a title that just kind of popped into my head. Something we can work with. So for now, I'm going to turn this into a page. I'm going to open up the page. And now that I'm in this page, I'm going to start by populating this with the basic structure that I'm going to follow for the essay. And that's something that I try to always keep the same. I just like to start with an intro. I'm going to move on to argument 1. I'm going to, cite opposing argument. And then I'm going to close with an argument in between. So that just kind of gives you a nice balanced approach, looking at things from 2 sides, and then really incorporating your own perspective on the matter with that argument in between. And of course, we're going to close with a conclusion. And the conclusion is just going to be a regurgitation. I can never say that word, regurgitation. I think that's correct, of the intro. So really what we need to do is find 3 good arguments and then draft an intro out of that and then repeat it sort of in a more concise form in the conclusion. And so I'm just going to now browse through this and I'm going to find the paragraphs, the permanent note paragraphs that I want to use in this essay. And so for this, I will actually copy paste the text because I don't want to create a block embed. Reason being that if I change the block, which I will almost definitely do in my essay, I don't want the original permanent note to change because I want to be able to still have that pipeline stay the same in case I use the permanent note for something else. And inevitably when I use it somewhere else, it's going to inspire a different adaptation of that same note. So I don't want the original ones to change, so I will just copy paste. There might be a better or more clever way to do this that I haven't found yet, so let me know if you're seeing the light on that. I so far I've only found like copy paste, which is not too complicated because it's literally right there. But maybe there's like a quicker or cooler way to do it, so let me know. And at this point, I actually forgot to mention one of the most important things, which is these keywords that we wrote underneath the permanent note in the categorization. And the reason why that's important is because now if I want to pull in more information into my essay from elsewhere in my Roam graph from sources that might not be excellent cheap, just to make the essay a little bit more interesting, I can actually go here to the permanent note in the sidebar. And for example, let's say I want to learn more about success, just find out where else in my Roam graph have I mentioned or have I imported something around the topic of success. And so what I'll do is I'll press Command, Shift, and Success right here in the sidebar, and I'll open up at the very top the references to that word. And so what you can see is the linked reference for this one particular keyword right in here, which is just the literature note itself. So that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is here in the unlinked references. And that is where you will see all of the mentions of the word success in my graph. And so it starts off with, a couple of excellent cheap related moments here. You can actually see a bunch of the other literature notes that mention it. So right away, it allows me to pull in from literature notes that I might have missed before. And now here, it becomes really interesting because, for example, here, okay, I've talked about this in the previous video. So here I can reference a script that I wrote before and maybe pull it into this essay. But here, for example, is from a Gmail import from one of the newsletters I follow. So this person happens to talk around, the topic of success and probably mentions the word. I mean, it's such a common word, right? So it's not surprising that it pops up in many different contexts, but the context in which it pops up might be surprising in relation to the essay that you write. So that is where I will now look for additional inspiration or material if I'm stuck in the essay, or if I just simply want to spice it up a little bit with sources from outside of Excellent Cheap. And so for this essay, I didn't do that because it's just a really short example essay, but that is where the power of Roam really comes in and where you can absolutely supercharge your workflow simply by picking a couple of general or even very specific keywords to then pull in more information from other sources. So here you can see the third door and you see all of the different, highlights where Alex Benign mentions that term. So you can really go crazy with this, but this is an important part I forgot, so I just wanted to insert it here before I move on to actually writing the essay. So now all that's left to do is just taking the permanent notes, copying them in there, adjusting them as needed to form the final essay. And I'm just gonna speed round through this and then we can talk about it. So this process ended up taking me exactly 17 minutes to the second. And what I'm doing here is going through and taking each and every block that seems relevant, and I'm just placing it in the first place that comes to mind. And afterwards I'm going through and adding some lines here and there, maybe some connecting phrases in between the blocks. And what's important to note here is that the first iteration of this, simply by placing the blocks, wasn't very coherent. But what it did is it gave me ideas for how to actually structure the essay and draw it all together thematically. So it was the blocks that actually gave me the overall themes and structures as opposed to coming up with them first. Instead, I was able to scratch a couple of the blocks that I pulled in initially and replace them with some other thoughts that came up in the process. And even though this essay might not score me an academic award, it should still be an interesting read and hopefully provide interesting perspectives on this topic. So here we go. It was not an instant process, but it was incredibly fast considering that I would have otherwise had to find all the source materials from scratch, go through it, start drafting something, then come up with other ideas of like, oh, where do I need to find this other thing? Go out to search it again, pull it into Roam, keep on repeating that process. So when comparing it to this traditional way of doing it, this approach just seems so much faster, so much more effective, and the work that you do within your Zettelkasten approach over time should really stack and consistently increase the material that your permanent notes create, or that your permanent notes allow you to create rather, because the more you engage with a topic and the more permanent notes you write, and the more you go back onto your existing permanent notes and adjust them with every, iteration of you using them in different contexts, the better the quality should get. And that applies to literally any topic. It applies to any media, whether you're writing videos or blog posts or articles, whether you're doing it for fun or professionally, it doesn't matter. Ultimately, by using this step-by-step approach, it should just exponentially increase the effectiveness and the quality of your output, no matter what you're working on. And so for my parting thoughts, I'm just going to take you on a quick sunset walk here with my dogs because we're in a beautiful location, and why not? Zettelkasten for me is not a system I have completely adopted yet in my everyday workflow. I really use it quite selectively, and for me, this application is the main reason to use Zettelkasten. And that is because it is almost uniquely designed to turn notes into content, because it forces you almost to engage with content, with notes, over and over and over again in different ways, in different contexts. And as you're doing that, you become incredibly well equipped to apply those notes in a variety of different contexts and to really elevate the yield of your notes, so to speak, over time. And I think that is why the system is so valuable. So if you are on a consistent basis looking to turn notes into content the way I just outlined, then Zettelkasten would definitely be for you. Let me know if you are using a different application of it, if you're using a different system altogether. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, and let me know if you want to see more videos on content creation based off of Roam research and note-taking techniques, because that's really something that's center mind for me right now. And so I'd love to make more videos about that. Let me know your thoughts, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Cheers.